SECfans.com got a preview show coming up later this week. Right now, we're going to do a little review for you of Week 9, which is a little crazy across the entire college football landscape, but inside the SEC, got mostly what we expected except for one game that we didn't. That's Tennessee and South Carolina, so we're going to talk about it. Got Husky Pup in the house each and every week. Going to get some stats thrown your way. So review show. Talking about what we saw this weekend, let's kick it off with the weird one, Tennessee at South Carolina. We both said in our show last week that this is going to probably be an ugly game because South Carolina plays defense, Tennessee's got injuries, struggles on offense, and it could – we picked Tennessee. I think the funny thing is we picked the score about right, just got the wrong winner. But both of us said we wouldn't be surprised if South Carolina won this game. And some of that comes from – the fact that, as you said before, as that score approaches a lower and lower number, then it's going to benefit the team that might be the underdog, and we can get into that in a second. But in this game, we saw kind of what we expected. Ugly game. South Carolina kind of stepped it up on the defensive side of the ball. Let's talk about what you saw in this game. Was it what you expected? And really, where do both of these teams go from here?
The deciding factor to me in this game was the quarterback play. And unfortunately, that slid against Tennessee and towards South Carolina, probably for the first time this season for South Carolina. Now, I'm not saying that South Carolina got great quarterback play. I mean, it's still a freshman being a freshman. He makes some mistakes. But he looked pretty competent. And a lot of what we'd seen from South Carolina in previous games was incompetent, frankly. I mean, the quarterbacks or McElwain, that just could not read a defense, complete a pass. And, if the quarterback can't complete a pass to an open man, particularly within 20 yards of the line of scrimmage, you're hamstrung in the game.
Unless you're playing Ole Miss.
Yeah, unless you're playing Ole Miss, you may never have to throw it. We'll discuss that later. But, yeah, if you can't complete those passes, your offense will not resemble whatever it should be, even if it's not very good. We've seen that the past few years from Vanderbilt, where they've had massive quarterback issues and their offense is just an utter complete disaster. And then we've seen it off and on with Kentucky. And it's pretty much a given in the game of football. If your quarterback just can't sit in the pocket and accurately deliver the football when it's available to you, then the defense has no reason to respect the pass. They can load up on the run. It means you can't execute half of what you're trying to do, and everything just completely freaking falls apart. So South Carolina got competent, and all of a sudden, because they have competent quarterback, they're suddenly a reasonably competent football team. Not saying they're good. And on the other side of the ball, it's like we said, Tennessee is so banged up right now that the offensive line can't get pushed. They can't run the ball the way they could the first few games. Defensively, they're an utter shell of what they were to start the season. I think a lot of people are going to look at the offensive injuries, particularly the offensive line, where they're down to now 1 of 5 starting linemen from the beginning of the year. But it's the defense. They had a very good defense and a very talented defense to start the season. As much as Butch Jones has recruited well, and he has improved the recruiting, I'll take a second to diverge here that you got to be careful when you talk about recruiting and improvement, right? Because if you've been getting ranked classes ranked number 25 every year, and then you start bringing in classes that are ranked number 12, you think, okay, look at our talents improving. We're being competitive in the SEC. It's like, well, yes and no. You're improving. You're getting more competitive, but Tennessee has not been getting top classes, honestly, within the SEC. So they've kind of stepped closer to everybody else, but when they got number 12th ranked class, most of the teams in the SEC, the major programs, are still getting top 10 classes. So even that class that pushes them closer, it's still not actually closing the gap per se. It's just you're going from behind by 15 spots in the rankings to behind by 5. And so the first couple of years, you see huge improvement because rather than being a 25th ranked recruiting class going against a 10th, well, now you're averaging out to a 17th against a 10th. Massive improvement. The next year, 13th against a 10th. Whoa, we're getting closer. The problem is because you only have 12th ranked classes, at some point you stop seeing that improvement. You're no longer closing the gap. And I say all that to say that Tennessee's classes haven't been good enough in depth to survive injuries the way they did this year. And they've got some really, really good starters, but you really saw the fact that Butch Jones' most recent classes haven't really been otherworldly. And they don't have the talent defensively to really impact the game. And, like we said at the very beginning of the season, too, Josh Dobbs is kind of what he is. He was about 8th to 10th in most statistical categories coming into the year. It was unreasonable to think that he was going to suddenly become so much better when he's already been in the program several years. He's gotten to where he's going to be. He's pretty close to his ceiling. And I think he's a very smart kid, and I think he's a great kid, but it was always unreasonable to expect Dobbs to carry the team. Um, there's a big difference between what South Carolina got, where they have competent quarterback play, and you can criticize him, but Muschamp's happy to play Neanderthal football, and he's not going to rely on the quarterback. Tennessee coming into this year had a game plan to rely on the quarterback, and that was probably misguided because Dobbs is good enough not to lose you a game and make some plays, but he's not good enough to carry this football team.
And it's an interesting point that you made about recruiting, and because I think some people get a little confused because they like to lump Tennessee, and I've even done it too. I think I've done it on this show. They like to lump Tennessee in with an LSU where you're the king of the state. You're the state program. You don't have a lot of competition, so you get all that talent. But if you really look at it, Tennessee is not a talent-rich state for football. Actually, an argument can be made that South Carolina has more talent in it than the state of Tennessee. The only place where Tennessee is talent-rich is Memphis, and that's the one area where they have to compete. Even though they're the state school and Memphis is in Tennessee, they have to compete with Ole Miss, Alabama, some Big 12 schools, and Tennessee gets in there too. So for all the people that think, oh, Tennessee should be raking in recruiting, that's really not the case. They have to be a national brand to be successful. And throughout their history, all the times where they were successful, even under Fulmer, it was because they were casting a national net. And right now they're not that national brand, so it impacts the talent that they have on their roster.
Yeah, it's important to understand that Tennessee is one of the most talent poor states, oddly enough, in the Southeast. Now, you can go and talk about why that is, but they simply, per capita, do not put out anywhere near the number of athletes the surrounding state does. And if you compare like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama to Tennessee, that all have these great big state schools, honestly, it's almost comical the difference. Now, Tennessee's biggest strength in recent years has actually been recruiting. In the Fulmer era, it was they recruited the northern part of Alabama, the northwestern part of Georgia. They recruited Memphis really heavily, but they also really went into Kentucky and South Carolina and the Carolinas in general. And I think it's something a lot of people miss out on is the emergence of South Carolina as a competent team, the emergence of Kentucky as at least a borderline competent team. You have Duke, North Carolina suddenly good. Everybody sort of looks south on what's hurting Tennessee, but they have a tremendous amount more competition to the north. And I think that often gets greatly ignored, right? Fulmer had no competition in Kentucky, North Carolina, or South Carolina for recruits. Clemson was not very good in a lot of those periods. South Carolina was terrible. Kentucky was terrible. Duke and North Carolina weren't on the map. So they could get whoever they wanted in that whole set of states. And now they aren't able to pull that. And that's also a big, big impact. But I'm going to back up my statement, right, about saying that Tennessee isn't been that good in recruiting. I was looking back at it. 2014, they were 5th in the SEC. 2015 was their best class. They ended up being 2nd. And then 2016, they were 7th. Excuse me. So, the 15 class was good. Don't get me wrong, but those 3 classes, you're looking at about a 5th ranking on average within the conference. And that's just not good enough to overpower people and deal with injuries on this level. They're consistently right now they've been around Georgia, probably behind Texas A&M. Auburn's gotten more talent than them. And I will say they have not signed a 5-star recruit in the past 3 years.
And what's interesting about that is, where you're looking at just on its face, that class, that's 5th or 6th best in the SEC, it might be a decent class, but then you have attrition coming in, so you don't get all the guys that you thought you could get, and then you have zero margin for error on both coaching and depth. So you can't have a lot of injuries because then now you're talking about the ninth or 10th best class. And then you can't get out coached because you're already, at a disadvantage because you don't have the Jimmies and the Joes. And if you're also getting out coached, then it's going to show in your win-loss record. And I think that's what we're seeing a little bit from Tennessee. Maybe not from Jones. Maybe it's from DeBoard, in particular. But you've got a deficiency on your coaching staff. You have injuries off of what already wasn't a top-tier talent pool. There's no surprise that they're doing poorly.
Right. And I have a lot of respect for stuff they do. But I kind of want to reinforce it, right? That they have closed the gap in that they are now in like the fifth to seventh in the SEC range. I mean, they were clearly in the bottom third under Julie. They were very poor. And now they're in that range and they've closed it. But again, they haven't in any year beaten Alabama in recruiting rankings. Maybe one year they beat LSU, but on average, Alabama, LSU, Ole Miss, Georgia in this span has still been better. So even though they closed the gap, they're still not winning the race. I mean, they're still getting beat in that aspect. And if you look, just in total talent pool, even though they've gotten a lot more talented, again, one 5-star recruit. 5 stars, I know stars don't matter to a lot of people, but they certainly do in the aggregate, and they make a big impact in terms of impact players. The Calvin Ridleys of the world and the Leonard Fournettes can single handedly take over a game. In 2016 alone, there were 5 schools at Stein 5-star prospects in the SEC, and they also happened. Actually more than that, it was 7. But the top 5 classes all had at least one 5-star. The top 4 classes in the SEC, Alabama, LSU, Ole Miss, Georgia last year, all had 2 or 3. Tennessee didn't sign any. And they just don't have those impact kids. Like you said, they don't have depth. If you look at, by the way, I'm going with a team composite that 24/7 Sports puts together, which is a combination of rankings from all the different major sites. Again, you look nationally and they have a just overall team talent composite, which is pretty cool, that talks about the talent level overall for a football team. And Tennessee's 13th, which is very respectable, top 15 talent. But like you said, they're not quite that elite. So there's not a huge gap really between, say, 13th and 20th or 25th. And also, 13th may be high, but that's only 6th in the SEC in overall talent. Alabama, LSU, Georgia, Auburn, and Texas A&M are all still more talented, and Ole Miss and Florida are right behind them. So, what we've seen this year is they've gotten injuries, which has been really unfortunate luck, kind of getting pegged back. And all of a sudden, as Tennessee kind of got passed, arguably by Ole Miss or Florida, well, where does that put them in the talent rankings? Puts them ahead of South Carolina. And that's I mean that's kind of what we're seeing is just that they weren't quite at the level where they can afford to have any sort of bad luck or bad coaching and have tremendous amount of success.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit first about what we saw in this game in particular, because we haven't talked about South Carolina a whole lot, but we did see Jake Bentley, a freshman quarterback, as you said, play pretty competent. 2 touchdowns, 167 yards. The big one for me was 8.4 yards per, which for South Carolina this year, that may as well be Heisman worthy. And the big thing for me, though, is no turnovers. They had 0 turnovers, even though you think South Carolina is going to be outmanned by a Tennessee team. 0 turnovers where Tennessee had 3. Was this a game where the team that won should have won? Did South Carolina outplay Tennessee, or did they pull kind of a pressure? The favorite coming in had a little bit of pressure, too much weight on their shoulders, and the home underdog kind of stole it from them.
Well, I do think the team that should have won. I mean, South Carolina had better per play averages, rushing and throwing the ball. I think rushing, Tennessee may have had a very slight edge. They did, but it was still 3.7 to 3.2. But yeah, I mean, it came down to the fact that South Carolina threw it a little bit better. As we said, Tennessee's banged up really badly on defense. And the secondary, just the back seven is not holding up. Barnett's a good player, but he can't do it all by himself. The telling stat to me, we keep joking about this, but again, Josh Dobbs threw 26 passes, Bentley threw 20, but Josh Dobbs was also the second leading rusher for Tennessee and was completely ineffective, 2.3 yards per carry. John Kelly ended up being the leading rusher for Tennessee. It's 14 carries, 94 yards. That's a pretty good 6.7 yard per carry average, but you can tell they badly needed Kamara or a healthy Hurd in that game. South Carolina, on the other hand, where, Dobbs is getting 38 touches, which is more than half the touches that Tennessee had. South Carolina wisely didn't lean on the quarterback. They had him throw 20 passes, but they gave 27 carries to their leading running back. He had 4.7 per, and then their second leading rusher had 7 carries for 4. Bentley ended up with 10 carries, but for negative yardage, a lot of them were sacks. The point being, Will Muschamp wisely just ran the ball over and over and sparingly used the quarterback. And I think Tennessee leaned on again. Well, they did. I mean, they leaned on Dobbs. He had most of their touches, and again, he's just not good enough to carry the football team. He needs some guys around him. And if you're in a position where Joshua Dobbs has to win you the game, yeah, you can put up 21 points, but yeah, that's not enough to win a lot of football games.
It's really not. And one more thing I want to touch on in this game, it's really maybe insignificant to most people, but in this game it could have been a huge call on Tennessee's last drive, or their touchdown drive, I believe it was. There was one of the worst, most egregious calls for targeting I think I've ever seen. And this to me underscores why they still have some work to do to clean up this rule. Because for those of you who didn't see it, there were two DBs kind of converging on a Tennessee wide receiver. The DB in the front was kind of falling down a little bit, and the other DB tackled the Tennessee wide receiver from behind. Well, as the Tennessee wide receiver was coming down to the ground, he lowered his head, and he actually made the contact with the other DB that was on the way to hitting him in the chest, until the wide receiver lowered his head, made a little bit of contact, not even a lot of contact. There was no launching. There was no defenseless player situation. And not only did they call targeting, but they confirmed targeting after the replay. And I just think there's got to be a situation where, theoretically, if that's targeting, then a ball carrier could just go around and lower his head right before every tackle and get everybody ejected. I know that's ridiculous to say, but that's what happened in this play.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in this particular play, the Tennessee player lowers the crown of his helmet, right? And he's running forward. You have players coming from both sides. And because he lowers the crown of his helmet, the South Carolina guy basically hits him in the side, like in the ear hole, with a face mask / crown on the helmet. But you, I don't know as a defender what you can really do there, other than it's so awkward, kinetically. You can't really just stand up straight while you're trying to make a tackle. You do have to lean into it. I mean, if the ball, I almost feel like the rule should read, if the ball carrier lowers the crown of his helmet, that the defender shouldn't get called for targeting. It puts the defenders in an absolutely impossible situation.
And to be fair, I can see a case where it's a bang bang play and they throw a flag for targeting just to get it right. Let's go back and check it. The fact that it was confirmed by video and now this guy has to sit out 2 more quarters in the next game, I think that's just ridiculous. I think there's a smart way to handle this penalty, and they've made some changes already, but there's a smart way to handle this penalty where it still has an impact, and we see where it's making an impact, where it's a safer game already, without having this ridiculousness, because this is some funny business right here. They got to fix that. Anyway, that was just my one rant for the week, I promise. Moving on, last thing I want to touch on for these two teams, South Carolina's schedule and Tennessee's schedule. So South Carolina's sitting at 4-4. I'm going to give you the 4 games they got left. You tell me if they're going to a bowl or not. Missouri, Florida, Western Carolina, and Clemson. Is South Carolina going to a bowl?
Yes.
I think so too.
I think they beat Missouri, and I think they beat Western Carolina.
Yeah, I think, I will say this. I don't know that Florida is going to just run all over them either. Like, that game is going to be ugly, and South Carolina's not completely out of that one. So I think Clemson will probably drill them, but Missouri right now is just so in just ridiculous disarray. I can't see them beating anybody. So
I will jump in there and note too, the Clemson game. I'm not sure I would totally count that one out. If you follow the history of that series, good Clemson
Yeah.
teams have lost to bad South Carolina teams a lot, and
Well, and they
Clemson.
had to have a crazy play last year just to beat one of the worst South Carolina teams in the last decade. So you're not wrong there.
Yeah, no, Tennessee schedule. Yeah, I'll read it off for you. You know, Tennessee Tech, Kentucky, Missouri, Vanderbilt. That's not exactly murderers row. Now, will they win them all? I don't know. Kentucky's becoming a decent team.
I
Vanderbilt
think
is actually
Kentucky.
grinding its
Tell me,
way.
do you think Kentucky will be favored in that game?
I probably not. I don't. Well,
Okay.
mm, it depends on how healthy they are in 2 weeks, honestly. Because if they're this banged up or worse, yeah, Kentucky will probably be favored in that game. A lot of Tennessee fans may not love to hear that, but that's just the reality. Kentucky's actually, but it's large part because Kentucky's getting pretty good. Um, but
And we
yeah,
don't want to give it away because Kentucky is actually in our preview show, which is, good on them for making the preview show because, 3 or 4 weeks ago, we probably wouldn't have said that we'd talk about them at all this year. But that there's really, I don't know that there's much else to say right now about Tennessee and South Carolina. Tennessee is just absolutely beaten up. Tennessee fans, take it easy on Butch Jones right now. I think if you want to pile on for him hiring Mike DeBoer, do that, but don't pile on the guy for losing games when he's playing second, third, fourth string guys just to field a team. That's unavoidable, and you can't blame strength and conditioning coaches for stuff like ACLs and shoulders. Like, you just can't. It's ridiculous. So good win for South Carolina. We'll see if they can get some momentum, but hopefully they can make a bowl.